A Harvard credential amplified a fringe extremist network. When Steven Pinker, Harvard psychologist and best-selling author, appeared on an Aporia podcast hosted by Noah Carl, far-right actors cheered. They see this as a strategic maneuver to legitimize race-based pseudoscience. Aporia is published by the Wyoming-based Human Diversity Foundation, or HDF, an LLC, or limited liability corporation, formed in 2022 to revive discredited biological hierarchies under the guise of scientific inquiry. So, Aporia's roots are in fascistic eugenics, and Steven Pinker, the popular scientist, the guy with some wild looking hair and a little twinkle in his eye, who seems polite and like he might not even be able to harm a fly. But it turns out that he's lending some credence to eugenics. And dig deeper, and HDF reveals strong ties to the long disgraced Pioneer Fund, funded by bigot billionaires and historically aligned with white supremacist ideologies. Contributors include Emil Kierkegaard, also known as William Engman, British ex-teacher Matthew Frost, also known as Matthew Archer, and the German AfD social media advisor Eric Ahrens. All three back aggressive remigration policies, code for deporting non-Europeans. So the money trail and hush money are an interesting aspect of the story. Aporia and HDF have received at least $1.3 million from former tech entrepreneur Andrew Conru, known for founding Adult Friend Finder, of all things, before he quietly distanced himself following media exposure. So, that's a quirky little factoid. And they know what they're doing. Undercover investigations by Hope Not Hate revealed audio evidence showing HDF's ambitions transform into a think tank that influences policy by recruiting mainstream writers, quote, for legitimacy by association, end quote. And apparently, Steven Pinker is keen on playing right into that. So, Pinker's participation fits a pattern. Critics like Patrick Hermanson from Hope Not Hate argue that Pinker's participation recklessly lends credibility to extremist racial theories, providing those ideas new oxygen in public discourse. And when Pinker appeared on this podcast, he did not, you know, seek to discredit their ideas in any way, in any meaningful way at least. Apparently, in the hour long discussion, Pinker echoed Charles Murray of the Bell Curve, endorsing Murray's critique that welfare erodes fatherhood, or as Pinker put it, quote, that is a problem, a huge class differentiated phenomenon. So Pinker's pattern of reaching across ideological lines is actually amplifying extremists. Pinker has previously included Steve Saylor essays and publications and participated in Saylor's human biodiversity email list. Malcolm Gladwell and others criticized him for providing cover to hereditarian thinkers. So why does it matter from a critical lens? Race science is not neural research. It supports elite driven narratives that justify inequality, uh, amplify borders, and state violence. So, from an anti authoritarian standpoint, such theories reinforce hierarchies that we should reject, at least in my opinion. Class, race, the overemphasis of patriarchal family norms, and they boost the perceived legitimacy of coercive state and corporate institutions. And that's, what we see with a lot of these ideologies. A lot of them are actually, they're depicted as if they're rebellious, but they're actually conformist ideologies, striving to maintain the prevailing power structure and to make them actually more harsh, more dangerous, and deadly. So, by lending his reputation to aporia, Pinker helps normalize narratives that blame societal injustices on inherent differences or supposedly inherent differences, deflecting attention from any systemic exploitation under capitalism or settler colonialism and the structural failings of the state. And in other words, it's actually not scientific, really, because we all know that there are some structural failings of the state, of historical colonialism, and capitalism, and that's even putting aside, the more intentional harm that these ideologies inflict. Even if you put a lot of that stuff aside, there are some failings there, and of course, cultural values that are prevalent in those institutions I just mentioned, those can also prove harmful. So to just exclude those from the discussion and present everything as if it has to do with inherent differences, it's a not only dangerous but non-scientific premise. It's a phony baloney way of framing everything, frankly. So there was also no meaningful response or accountability when the Guardian emailed Pinker's Harvard address. They pressed his press office and publisher, but got no reply, and the silence speaks volumes. So I'm just going to go over this again regarding the Aporia slash HDF. It's a rebranded pioneer fund with eugenic white nationalist roots. The funding includes $1.3 million dollars from Andrew Conru, who backed off post exposure. And the tactics include recruiting mainstream intellectuals for, again, legitimacy via association. And Pinker's stance is apparently that he embraced Charles Murray on family policy and intelligence, despite all the race science baggage. So, again, going back to the anti authoritarian critique, these ideas reinforce hierarchy and disguise systemic injustice, and they empower state slash capitalist violence, which we know to be factors in social problems. In fact, you can just pick up a newspaper and see with your very own beady little eyeballs that the status quo is indeed imposing violence on populations. I mean, some of you out there, you can see it without even looking at a newspaper. You can see it in real life. So the bottom line is that Pinker's appearance on Aporia isn't some innocuous intellectual exchange. It's a move that undermines serious critiques of power, state, and exploitation. By aligning with platforms rooted in pseudoscientific racism, he amplifies ideology that an anti authoritarian project must actively resist. So, unfortunately, Steven Pinker, with the wild hair and the little cute little glint in his eye, he's not as harmless as he looks like. He looks like he might not even be able to harm a fly, but it turns out that he's being linked with some disreputable groups. And speaking of which, that brings us to the peripheral poop head of the week, the second segment of my show within a show called uh, Dimwits, Dipshits, Dufuses, and Dullards. So, who is the peripheral poophead of this week? It's Alan Dershowitz. And there is a link between him and, um, Steven Pinker. During Jeffrey Epstein's first federal prosecution in 2006, Harvard linguistics professor Steven Pinker was asked by his pal Alan Dershowitz, Epstein's defense attorney, to detail his analysis of how the law defines using the internet to entice minors into illegal sex acts. Specifically, Pinker interpreted the statute 18 U.S. Code 2422B, which criminalizes using, quote, any means or facility of interstate commerce, end quote, to persuade or entice someone under 18 into prostitution or other illicit sexual activities. So, Dershowitz then inserted Pinker's expert interpretation into a court submission as part of Epstein's defense strategy. That letter aimed to show that Epstein's internet communications did not technically violate the enticement statute. The plea agreement that followed in June 2008 allowed Epstein to plead guilty to two state charges, one involving a minor, while avoiding all federal sex trafficking accusations, at least from what I understand here. Pinker later explained that his input was unpaid and done simply as a favor to a colleague. Well, isn't that nice? Don't you love favors? In 2019, he told BuzzFeed News that at the time he wasn't aware of the allegations' full nature. Once he understood the severity, as I kind of mispronounced the word, but once he understood the severity, he expressed regret. Quote, knowing what I know now, I do regret writing the letter. Maybe he had a little bit of a teary look in his eye, like the sad lost puppy dog look. You know, I don't know. I, I don't really know what he looked like at the time, but I imagine he was, maybe fake pouting or something like that when he. Who knows the way these people look when they say some of these things. But interestingly, Dershowitz vehemently denies allegations that he had sexual relations with Virginia Jeffrey, a key accuser in Jeffrey Epstein's legal saga. Unsealed deposition records raised the accusation, but Jeffrey later said she, quote, may have made a mistake, end quote, and defamation suits related to this were dismissed in November 2022. So keep in mind that accusers, they might drop lawsuits sometimes simply because they don't have the money that people like Alan Dershowitz or Steven Pinker or of course Jeffrey Epstein himself might have had. You know, what can you do if you don't have the same type of resources, the same level of help? You might just drop a lawsuit. So people they get pressured to drop lawsuits, and that may have been what happened here. I'm not sure. You know, that's why she used this language that she may have made a mistake. It's the verbiage there kind of suggests that she was unsure of whether or not she actually made a mistake. You know, it it wasn't like a full recant, whatever the legal term would be. I don't know, recantation, I guess. But here's another interesting fact: Jeffrey died in April of 2025, so this year, just a couple months ago, and it is said that she did herself in. But you know what they say about Epstein himself? And curiously, other Epstein accusers are no longer with us either. Carolyn Andriano, She testified against Ghislaine Maxwell and died of an accidental drug overdose in 2023. So there's also another one, Lee Sky Patrick. She died from a drug overdose in 2017, ruled accidental by the authorities, you know? And hey, how about this? Once we're, talking about accidental deaths, on July 14th, 2022, 73-year-old Ivana Trump died of blunt impact injuries to the torso after falling downstairs at her home on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. She was, of course, buried at the Trump National Golf Club, Bedminster. So, to my knowledge, there is no specific evidence suggesting she actually enjoyed playing golf herself, and some people speculate that she was buried there because of tax reasons. So that's a possibility. But there's still some debate about why she was buried there. As is public knowledge, in a deposition relating to their divorce, Ivana accused Donald of sexual violence. Ivana sort of recanted that claim. She suggested that she may have been using some fuzzy language or something like that. She said it was maybe too strong of a word or something along those lines, and she backed away from that claim. But interestingly, Ivana had to sign a non-disclosure agreement as a condition of the divorce settlement, and she was required to seek loving Don's permission before publicly discussing their marriage. So keep that in mind as you ponder why she might have been buried in a golf course. Were there fears that maybe she was going to come out with certain bits of information? I don't know. I don't know. I, I think there's a little bit of food for thought. Maybe she really did like golf. I don't know. But the whole thing sounds a bit like an episode of the Forensic Files to me. A rich guy, he has a wife who accused him of abuse. They get a divorce. Um, he's got all these powerful pals. She winds up dead and buried in a golf course. You know, it, it's a very weird thing that sounds Forensic Files ish. So anyway, getting back to the factual and contextual aspects of the Epstein Dershowitz Pinkerton thing. The law at issue 18 USC 2422B penalizes using any means or facility of interstate commerce, like the internet, to persuade, induce, or entice a minor into prostitution or illegal sexual activity. So the broader environment in 2006 was that under President Bush at the time, the DOJ launched a major task force targeting child abuse crimes, a period when hundreds of offenders were pursued, yet Epstein's case was shelved federally despite strong victim evidence. And charges and plea specifics were interesting too. Although federal authorities drafted a detailed indictment with sentences that might have reached life in prison, the final outcome was a controversial non prosecution agreement granting Epstein and even unnamed accomplices immunity from federal charges. Well, isn't that convenient? Isn't that nice? It's not like Epstein was rich or anything like that. No, he's not. He wasn't known for being a rich guy. So critiques from victims and activists have been long-standing. Palm Beach Police Chief Michael Reiter, he said that he was suspicious of the slow prosecution pace, escalated the evidence to the FBI to seek federal charges. Later, the Miami Herald exposed that victims weren't informed of the NPA, a violation of the Crime Victims' Rights Act. And, I'm going to examine this in a way that I often do on this podcast here. I'm going to look at this from the anarchic lens. The point of that is to say that despite being a party of law and order, quite often the Republican Party and the corporate Democratic Party often actually feed anarchist critiques of power. So, from an anarchist standpoint, which distrusts hierarchical power, legal systems, and institutional injustice, this this whole thing highlights several urgent issues. Unequal application of justice. Epstein's wealth allowed him to access top tier lawyers like Alan Dershowitz, manipulate prosecutorial discretion, and exploit loopholes in federal law, even when statutes like the one mentioned are meant to protect minors. And, there are signs of state complicity possibly here. The DOJ's initial ignoring of victim rights, the secret immunity clauses covering unnamed collaborators, and the forced plea highlight institutional protection for the powerful. The the old critique, like the most basic critique of power, is a prevalent factor here. So, you've got also the expertise as a tool of power here. The legal strategy hinges on picking experts to twist technicalities of law. In this case, Steven Pinker, though not a legal expert technically, he wielded linguistic authority in a courtroom, so they saw him as a linguistic expert, showing how credentials can be weaponized, and weaponized they were in this case. And the brave actions of authorities like Chief Reiter, I don't want to totally discredit every type of authority here. Chief Reiter, Reiter, he should be noted as, sort of an exception to the rule. And, there was also the resilience of Epstein survivors. I think they set a precedent for challenging institutional complacency, but, the the stuff still happened, and it probably wasn't enough of a precedent to really change that much, unfortunately. So, in the summer of 2006, Pinker's linguistic breakdown of the enticement statute became a key component in Epstein's defense. That defense sharply limited accountability. Epstein pled to minor state offenses and escaped broader federal charges. The plea agreement shackled the prosecution, granted sweeping immunity, and left serious federal sex trafficking allegations off the table. So, oddly enough, he played a major role in all of this. So, viewed anarchist style, from the deviant, godless anarchist lens, this is more than a legal nuance, it's a pattern. Those with privilege exploit legal expertise and institutional weakness to escape justice. Meanwhile, survivors pay the price, and, sometimes they apparently end up dead in like a shocking amount of numbers, conveniently to the powerful. And this case really shows the urgent need to challenge it and expose the elite structural immunity and recenter power with grassroots justice movements. Because unfortunately, you just have to apply pressure to have a sense of justice in cases like this. So Dershowitz was part of Donald Trump's impeachment defense team, also, if you may recall, as well as the O.J. Simpson Dream Team alongside Johnny Cochran and F. Lee Bailey. So he's got quite a track record. He was also loosely associated with election denialism hijinks. So, as an article in Writer's Notes, and I'm going to quote them here, a federal appeals court on Friday overturned a judge's sanction against retired Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz over his work on a lawsuit by failed Republican Arizona gubernatorial candidate Carrie Lake. Dershowitz and two other lawyers were fined $122,200 in 2023 for advancing frivolous claims in the unsuccessful case, which challenged the use of electronic voting machines in Arizona's 2022 midterm elections. Dershowitz had argued that he played only a nominal part in Lake's lawsuit in an of counsel role. So, end quote for the article. In other words, Dershowitz got off on a technicality, but one wonders how nominal his role really was. I mean, keep in mind his legal prowess here. He's actually not somebody who's like a bumbling goofball, sort of like Rudy Giuliani. Dershowitz is like Giuliani only with some more actual skills to pay the bills. And that's why he's so commonly sought after. You know, he was on O.J. Simpson's legal team, and we all know what happened there. So I guess you got to give some credit where it's due. He is a skilled lawyer. So on that note, remember that Dershowitz also defended Jim Bakker. So he is part of the third segment of this episode, which is the fetid fever dream flashback of the week. The biggest scandal involving Jim Bakker was the PTL, or Praise the Lord scandal, of the late 1980s, which exposed massive financial fraud, sexual misconduct, and the deep entanglement of religion, media, and yes, capitalism. Here's a breakdown of that whole thing, which is interesting, and yes, I'm going to look at it from the sort of anarchic perspective. So, what happened with Jim Bakker? Well, he was a televangelist and founder of the PTL Club and Heritage USA, which was a Christian theme park and resort. In the 1980s, he built an evangelical empire worth hundreds of millions. Then it all collapsed under the weight of scandal, and that included financial fraud. Bakker and his team raised tens of millions through lifetime partnerships, as they called them, promising donors stays at Heritage USA. But the promises far exceeded capacity. The money was used to enrich the leadership, not build sustainable infrastructure. So there was also sexual misconduct. In 1980, Bakker paid Jessica Hahn, a church secretary, hush money after allegedly drugging and abusing her. This cover up, funded by donor money, eventually came to light. And there was a conviction. In 1989, Bakker was convicted on 24 counts of fraud and conspiracy, sentenced to 45 years, later reduced, and he served 5 years in prison. So think about that, going from 45 years to 5 years. Hmm. So, what is the wicked anarchist perspective on this? You know, the skeptical anarchic lens. Well, of course, they would be skeptical of hierarchical power structures, capitalism, and organized religion. So the Bakker scandal is I guess you might call it the Baker's dozen, because there are dozens of side issues to capitalism that are linked with this particular scandal. You know, the the way that money just seeps into everything. It is itself sort of a religion. You know, Jim Bakker, his real god was actually the almighty dollar, and that's true of so many of these. You know, these so-called Christians. They pray to the almighty dollar. Well, I guess they also pray PREY based on the almighty dollar. You know, it's a textbook case of authoritarianism and institutional rot wrapped in holy branding. And, um, one, you've got the power concentrated at the top, That's point number one. And anarchism critiques top down hierarchies. So PTL was structured like a corporate cult, with Bakker at the top controlling money, narrative, and public image. This kind of unchecked leadership invites abuse, and it delivered that. What a big surprise. Cults leading to abuse, never heard of that. It's never happened before. This is a rare instance of it. I'm being sarcastic there, of course. All right. So, point number two, there's exploitation of the poor. PTL raised money largely from working class Christians. Many sent their life savings in the belief they were serving God. And the wicked anarchist would call this systemic theft, masked by spiritual manipulation. Religion used as a tool of control and extraction. So, you tell me, is the anarchist critique phony baloney there, or is the religious claim phony baloney? Okay, how about option number three for like the list of ways in which this scandal reveals the dangers of power? The state's role. Well, Bakker was prosecuted, which from a lot of perspectives would be good. A cynical anarchist type might argue that this was more about preserving public trust in the system than justice. Many equally corrupt figures in religious and corporate spheres never face consequences, and the state acted only when Bakker became a liability, and they actually let him get off easy with a reduced sentence. Remember, the initial sentence, from what I recall, was decades, basically probably the rest of his life or close to it in prison, but I guess it was only 5 years. And option number four of the cynic list would be the commodification of faith. So PTL turned salvation into a product. Hotel rooms, theme parks, luxury condos in God's name. It's what Jesus would have done. So anarchists would see this as capitalist co-optation of belief, where even spirituality is just another thing to sell. You know, it reminds me of the scene in Spaceballs where Mel Brooks's parody of oh crap, I can't even remember the character's name. Um, but anyway, Mel Brooks there is like listing off all the Spaceballs related merchandise that they could, promote as a tie-in to the film. And in this case, it's not a movie; it's the religion itself that is full of these marketable wonders. All right, so option number five is the institutional religion as a control mechanism. So Bakker's empire reinforced the anarchist critiques of organized religion as a hierarchical tool to maintain order, obedience, and submission, and just to rip people off, not spiritual liberation or anything like that. And his semi downfall exposed the rot beneath the holy surface, which really did help make it a scandal. But again, it's it's also a matter of them possibly wanting to protect their image, the powers that be, because maybe the scandal was going to be exposed one way or the other. I don't know. I'm actually surprised when they actually do pursue cases like this, to be honest, because you know it it seems like they increasingly are not doing that sort of thing, where they increasingly just let people get away with this sort of rotten behavior. But anyway, Jim Bakker's scandal wasn't just a fall from grace; it was a crash course in how power corrupts, especially when dressed in religion and soaked in money. So, from the wicked anarchist standpoint, it wasn't a failure of one man, it was the inevitable result of a system built on greed, obedience, control, and just general rip-offs.